special panel discussion as part of the European Capital of Culture Memoryscapes project. This was initially envisioned as part of a conference, a multi-day conference, as the Seasons of Power flagship in EPK 2020. We were going to discuss the socialist period. There was going to be many panels, and this was one of the panels. So unfortunately, we weren't able to have the conference as we wanted to, but I'm happy to host one of the panels put together by a good colleague and a good friend, Igor Duda, from the University of Pula. He's an associate professor of history there, and he's worked on tourism and leisure culture in socialist Yugoslavia. And his previous project was Making of the Socialist Man. And I had a chance to see a lot of the results of that project from the Croatian Science Foundation. And the current project today that you'll be presenting is sort of a follow-up on that, and it's the microstructures of Yugoslav socialism, focusing on Croatia 1970 to 1990. And I've had a chance to hear some of the presentations already. I've been on some panels with you. I've had a few of you guest lecturing in other classes, but I think it's a great opportunity to have a group like this present at least the beginning results of your research. I know the project is going to last a few more years, so Igor, perhaps you can introduce the project more broadly and also introduce your team members. So Igor.
Okay, now you can hear me, I hope,
Yeah.
and you see the presentation, right? Hello everybody, of course, and thank you, Vjeran, for hosting us, for giving us an opportunity to speak to a wider audience about our project and our current results. It's been a hard year, of course. Some of the conferences have been cancelled, so really it is a nice change to speak outside of our own classrooms and to other students and to other colleagues and wider audiences. I'm not alone here, as you can see. A part of the project team is with me, Tina, Anita, and Sasha, but I'm going to mention the names again later on and present them properly. Yes, as you said, the full title of the project is Microstructures of Yugoslav Socialism, Croatia 1970-1990. Microsocialism is the acronym of the project. We started a bit more than 2 years ago, so it's half time, more or less, and we will be working until November 2022. Much more about the project can be found on the web page. You see the web address here. There is also a shorter version in English to which you can enter from this Croatian page. As you said, the project is financed by the Croatian Science Foundation, and it is based at the University of Pula at our Center for Cultural and Historical Research of Socialism. Who is working on the project? Who makes the project team? Chiara Bonfiglioli, who is currently in Ireland at the University College Cork. Magdalena Najbaragičić from Croatia, University Nord, Sveučilište Sjever. Christian Axbo Nielsen from Denmark, from Aarhus University. And then the names which I have already mentioned. So Anita Buhin, who is our postdoc associate at the university and at the project. Tina Filipović, who is assistant at the history department in Pula and a doctoral student within the project, doing her PhD at the University of Zagreb, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And Saša Vejzagić, who is finishing, hopefully next month, his PhD studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Of course, there is also Ulf Grumbauer, not exactly a part of the project team, but our consultant and a valuable addition, of course, to the project team. Our plan was and still is to cover a number of different topics. Each researcher is covering a specific topic and covering actually two municipalities within socialist Croatia. Croatia was divided in about 115 municipalities between 1960s and early 90s. So we've chosen some of them and entered in the structure of these municipalities through the municipal assemblies, the local committee of the League of Communists, the local conference of the Socialist Alliance of the Working People, and a number of other bodies. And actually, we are covering the following topics. Magda is working on the media in a local community, in a municipality. Christian Axbo Nielsen is covering the topic of public and state security. Tina is working on partisan war veterans, on SUBNOR, their organization. Chiara Bonfiglioli is working on the role and position of women in the society, especially through their organization, which was active within the Socialist Alliance of the Working People. Anita is covering the field of culture, especially the self-managing communities of interest in the field of countries, in the field of culture within 2 municipalities. Sasha is in charge of economic history, relations between certain municipalities and some large companies which were operating on their territories, but also wider in Croatia or the whole Yugoslav Federation. My 2 topics are the protection of self-managing relations and rights through the office of the of something what we might try to translate as ombudsman, and the larger topic about which I'm going to speak later today, the local communities, literally translated like that, Mjesna, zajednice, so the role of citizens as self-managers in their neighborhoods. Here on the map, you can see those municipalities in Croatia during the 70s and 80s. The orange ones are the ones we are working on through all these different topics. We are trying to cover the relation between the organizations of associated labor, between the self-managing communities of interest and social political communities, being the local communities, municipalities, or the very Republican level. Of course, another interesting triangle is the relation between the state on the local level or Republican level or the federal level, the League of Communists, and different social or social-political organizations. Between them and, of course, the people which were representing them and leading them on the local level, quite often exchanging these levels and these organizations and being active for years and years or decades. The municipality of Rijeka from the 70s and 80s is not, unfortunately, maybe, probably, unfortunately, at least in this context, one of our chosen municipalities. But Rijeka was the center of one of the regions of Croatia back then. The regions were called communities of municipalities, zajednice, Općina. This region was covering Istria, the Kvarner Islands, Croatian littoral, Gorski Kotar. So yes, in so many different ways, while talking about the municipalities of Labin, Pula, or Rovinj, we have to mention the regional level between Pula and Zagreb, for example, and the regional level was in Rijeka. So we cannot avoid what was going on in Rijeka, either on the municipal level or on the regional level, and bits of these informations and the data we have so far will be included in some of the presentations today. You see the titles of presentations, and you have been informed about them already. Anita will be first, then Sasha, Tina, and me at the very end. Yes, another sentence about the other black and white map on the slide. Apart from the municipalities, the black dots are representing local communities, Mjesna zajednice. So you can see their number in each specific municipalities, which of course quite often corresponds to the structure of the territory and to the number of people living in a certain municipality, level of urbanization, and so on and so on. So this is the intro about the micro-socialism project, and now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Anita to step in. Anita, the floor is yours. As I said, Anita is an associate in the project. She was a part of my former project on the making of the socialist man. She's part of the team again. 2 years ago, she completed her PhD studies in Florence. Before that, MA studies at CU in Budapest and BA and MA studies in Pula. And she's now already an expert in cultural history of socialist Yugoslavia. Anita, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? Is it fine? Yes, okay. Hello, thank you everyone for inviting me for this lecture / panel. I'm also very glad I have the opportunity to talk not just to the students presented at Zoom, but also to the wider audience through a YouTube channel, and especially because I think today we like to talk a lot about participation, citizens' participation in the culture, while we, in the same time, forget that there is a whole history of participation of citizens and workers in culture. So I will try to guide you through the basis of the self-managerial transformation of culture on the local level. And I'm really happy that I even managed to include some examples from Rijeka. So I hope I will satisfy that minimum of the requirement. But before we start talking about the self-managerial transformation of culture, the idea of giving culture back to the workers is not the new one. It started already since the beginning of socialism, especially with the implementation of socialist practices in Yugoslavia in 1945, and the proclaimed idea of culture giving culture to the workers changed a lot through these 45 years. However, some of the things stayed the same. One of the main ideas was to democratize culture, so-called democratization of culture, which went through lots of phases, but all the time there was a question of how to make workers not just passive consumers of culture, but actually participants, meaning both in planning or to actually enable workers to self-express themselves if they have ability, need, or desire to do so. The second thing that was supposed to be overcome by the democratization of culture was the difference between high culture and low culture. This we can connect with the fourth point I made here, which is the question of mass culture. Since there was and still is, there was this idea of elitist idea of many cultural workers who actually believed that people or the workers are not actually ready to take charge of producing culture in the way it was imagined centuries ago. The third question which is opened is actually the question between professionalism and amateurism. Of course, no one demanded or believed that there will be no professional workers in culture, being artists or people who organize culture, but the question of amateurism was taken finally serious. And there was this idea, again, through the democratization of culture, that these things should be treated equally, at least when we are talking about ideology or financing. And the fourth thing, which I think is maybe crucial when we want to talk about socialist culture, is the dichotomy between mass culture and culture for masses. There are numerous papers that I'm not going to mention here, which are actually discussing what is the real mass culture. Is it that the one which is coming from the masses, from the workers, or is it more of a hybrid between what the ideology and political actors actually have, and with the cooperation with the cultural workers are actually making a culture that is adjustable for the workers and common people. These are all the questions that you can open when you want to discuss about socialist culture or workers' culture. However, on the example of socialist Yugoslavia, we can follow several stages of implementation of democratization of culture. The first one is budget finance culture, which was happening until mid-1960s. And it was marked by financing culture through the state from collected taxes, and money was going to traditional cultural institutions. Then the change came in 1965 with the change to fund finance culture, which basically local municipalities established their own cultural funds, and they were allocating money to the funds. And then representatives of cultural institutions were actually choosing where the money goes, and the money usually stayed inside of the traditional official higher institutions of culture. Lots of things changed in the mid-1970s with the new constitution of 1974 and the Associated Labor Act in 1976, which made possible the further democratization of culture, not just culture, but since we're talking about that, I will focus on that. And one of the things that constitution enabled people is to give a right to decide the purpose and way of spending the means for common social needs. A right to free exchange of labor, mutuality and solidarity, a right to self-management, abandonment of all technical and bureaucratic rulings, and implementation of delegate system. Basically, that meant that every person has the right, every working person has the right to decide where they can put parts of their salary into the social needs and culture included, and to participate in these all procedures, and also to participate in creation of the program and not just allocating funds. On the other hand, the Associated Labor Act of 1976 further developed and implemented self-management on every level, and basic organization of associated labor, or it was the smallest legal entity that actually was served as the basis for choosing the representatives, i.e. delegates, for all the changes that were happening. When it comes, this is just a quick slide for terminology. So OUR is Organization of Associated Labor, MZ, Mjesna, zajednica, local community, like Igor explained a bit earlier, and SIS is self-management community of interest. I put here the Croatian short terms because they're also, for one point, they're taken as part of the language today, and the second hand, it's really hard to translate these almost purely Yugoslav socialist terminology. And this is especially the case with local communities, as Igor also noticed a bit before in his talk. When we talk again, there is also self-managerial transformation of culture, which is the official term of what was happening in culture from 1975 on with the implementation of CISAs and the relations of free exchanges of labor, which were done through signing the self-managing agreements that were signed by workers and citizens in MZs with cultural workers. So what did actually self-managerial transformation of culture mean? Here is a quote: universal creative and self-creative activity with which a person confirms versatility of itself. The self-managerial transformation of culture actually went back through to Marxist and Leninist writings of culture, where culture was meaning actually the totality of life. So not just the arts, not just traditional cultural activities, but actually the way of living, the way of communicating, the way of treating each other. Work should also become culture, and so on. So from one side, we have this traditional way of enabling workers to actually creatively express themselves, also in their working organizations and not just in their free time, through cultural artistic self-activities, as they were called. So many organizations and factories had their literary sections, their art sections. They were also invited especially to to nurture traditional folk dances and so on. And these were a part, they were organized as a part of a working environment. On the other hand, we can also trace a popularization of books, and many factories actually organized their own libraries, or workers were motivated to become members of libraries. There were so-called bibliobuses, which were movable libraries from the local library who bought a bus, and basically they were going around organizations and loaning books to workers during their working time. And the third way of actually bring culture to the workers inside of their working space was turning working halls into galleries. So there were lots of exhibition going on in working halls, sometimes even some theater plays or whatever. So basically kind of bringing culture to the workers, but also in a very, very traditional way. On the other hand, there is this notion of that the culture should be the substance and the way of life and work. And this meant aestheticization of a working place, which meaning taking care of the working halls, the canteen, gardening outside of the factories, as the next point says, green areas, taking care of how you are dressed. If they're working clothes, they should also be nice. And here we can also see really specific gender division, because female factories, for instance, cloth production and so on, were usually noticed as being better in this aestheticization of a working place. On the other hand, we have like this further, the most theoretic part, let's say, like humanizing working process and affirming creativity in work, which was dreamt of, but in all the materials I've encountered so far, we have seen so little of it, because there were still all these first steps to be passed. My case studies are Pula and Karlovac, and I decided on them because they are the big towns, but not in one of the top 4 in Croatia. They have a big number of mixed population with lots of people from other nationalities. They both had really big industries. In Pula, Uljanik, in Karlovac, Jugoturbina. They were both really big military places. And the worker structure is quite similar, with a big number of people participating in the second in the industry, actually, while we can still see some division in this first sector, which actually reflects in culture. Here I put just some data that I found in statistics. This is from the 1978, and I included Rijeka here, which is bigger than Pula and Karlovac, and it also shows in the organizational culture. And I think in a comparative way, it's actually really useful to see what are the successes of cultural policies and what are actually some kind of, let's say, natural ways of development because of the number of people that live in there and so on. So these are the number of cultural organizations that are under CIS. In Pula there were 7, in Karlovac there were 7, in Rijeka there were 15. These numbers in brackets are actually showing the wider space of the municipality. So the first number is like really the city, the town, and this other number, it actually shows the nearby villages that are officially under the municipality. We can also see that there is a really big difference between Pula and Karlovac and Rijeka on number of citizens employed, number of employed actually people in local organizations of culture comparing to number of citizens. We can also see the differences between number of seats in halls of organization and number of citizens, and actually in the reading rooms of working organization, which is more or less the same, but the number just says more than 1,000. And here in the left, where there is explanation, the numbers in brackets are the Republican average number, actually. When it comes to centralization of culture, this number also tells us about number of organizations. So as we can see, Rijeka has lots, sometimes even more than double organizations than Pula and Karlovac, which to a certain level actually corresponds to the number of people living in Rijeka comparing to Pula and Karlovac. And this is actually, according to archives and the political workers of that time, it was the biggest problem of this transformation of culture, because basically the richer and bigger municipalities had more money to put in their institutions, while the smaller municipalities had less money. So the differences were through the years growing bigger and bigger. And here I will just shortly just announce from the research I did so far. I did the case study of Pula. Now I collected all the material for Karlovac, which I need to analyze. And there were several problems with this self-managerial transformation of culture. The first one was the problem with delegation system, which means the delegates which were chosen from owners, mostly from the industry, and citizens from local communities, did not fully participate in the work of the SIS, or they voted automatically, which means that they were going to the meetings just perform, while they didn't have time to prepare, to read the materials. They didn't really discuss with their base what programs do they want to hear or participate in, but they just basically voted for mostly for whatever it was put on the daily agenda, or they were representing their own needs and not the need of their organization. Meaning, for example, if a worker was interested only in theater, he sometimes, or she sometimes really pushed that there will be more theater plays in the city of Pula, in the municipality of Pula for that year, and not representing actually if maybe people wanted, people from his organizations wanted something different. On the other hand, cultural workers, which were also part of the SIS, still thought of culture in elitist terms, and they had really hard time of adjusting to consider non-cultural workers as their equals. But the other problem is that through this avoidance of budget or funds, actually it was really hard to finance their salaries. So even until the late 1980s, they still could not earn as much money as actually people, the normal workers, let's call them like that. The other problem was that means dedicated to culture were actually minimal and not satisfactory. The Republican data says that they varied from 0.1 to 1.1 of worker salaries. And when you collected this percentage from each salary, it actually wasn't enough for financing the basis, and let's not even talk about development and further ideas of culture. And the third, the biggest problem when we come back to these Marxist terms of culture, owners, especially the ones in manual labor, did not transform into organizations of culture. And still the only culture activities that stayed were actually amateur cultural activities that were organized through devotion and passion of some workers. And in conclusion, because I ran out of time, actually, so the only comparative case studies, I believe, should give us full picture functioning of SIVs of culture, because if there were some problems in Pula, it doesn't mean I'm going to find them in Karlovac. So the question is whether the delegate system didn't function because of the idea was wrong, or because it was implemented wrong, or maybe people were wrong. This is what we can find out only when we do a bigger comparison. However, this is definitely the biggest experiment in radical democracy in culture that not only Yugoslav, but we can also say in more global level happened during that time, since everyone could be actually chosen to be a delegate, and they could, if they were prepared, they could propose and demand their needs, cultural needs, to be satisfied. However, I don't want to simplify this, so I believe that there is a really complex view on reasons for the failure. One part was definitely human element, that sometimes delegates were not interested in what they were chosen to do. The second one was the question of education. It takes some time to actually educate yourself to fully participate in something. And as one of my sources says, maybe after 3 generations of workers participating in culture, that would happen. But since there was only 15 years of application of the system, these 3 generations didn't happen. So we really don't know if the system would success or fail. And here I will stop and let, I don't know who is next.
Thank you, Anita. I should know who is next. Saša is Yes, please, everybody, keep your questions for later. We'll have time at the very end for questions, answers, discussion, and so on. And now from suprastructure, we are moving to the base, from culture to economy, and to the very north of Croatia. Saša, as I said earlier, is finishing his PhD studies at EY in Florence in business history. And before that, he studied at CU in Budapest and in Pula. Saša, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello to everybody. Let me just prepare for a second. Thank you for having me here. As Igor said, I'm just finishing my PhD, which really complements the topic here that I'm talking about today. And there are a lot of things that I wanted to say, so I'll start immediately. And I had them written instead of preparing them maybe by heart. What I will present is more narratively. It goes more into the biography of the company that I looked at, and the company is Građevinski kombinat Međimurje. That doesn't exist anymore, but it was extremely important for the city of Čakovec. I will show you in a bit where it is, and for the whole, not just for the city, but for the whole county and even and wider. I will start with the sentence that when I studied, we made fun of it a lot, because we said that people who are working on second Yugoslavia always start their research with after the World War II. So I'll start with the same sentence. After World War II, Čakovec was a tiny city, a home to artisans and craftsmen. The city was and still is the administrative center of Međimurje county, a continental island located between two rivers of the Croatian northern border. Because of its geographical position, for the most part of the modern history, Međimurje was a neglected Hungarian periphery with overwhelmingly dominant Slavic population. Soon after liberation, or in 1948, the county faced a serious economic shock due to the conflict between the party leadership and Cominform. Because of its direct vicinity to the border with the Eastern Bloc, as a precaution in case of Soviet invasion, the central government relocated its scarce industrial capacities to Sisak and deeper into the Bosnian mountains. At the same time, this undevelopmental measure was complemented with restriction on capital investments that lasted until 1956, when Tito and Khrushchev briefly warmed up relations between the two countries. To sum up, economically already impoverished region, which was furthermore stripped of modernization, and until the second half of the 1950s, it depended on agriculture and small artisan workshops. Unlike today, when Međimurje is considered as one of the richest regions of Croatia, next to Istria. The county, however, had several competitive advantages favorable for starting a construction industry. Firstly, the craftsmen working in Međimurje were mostly in construction-related businesses like woodworkers, builders, brick producers, plumbers, etc. Secondly, for more than 2 centuries, a large portion of these workers were used to a culture of semi-gastarbeitership, or labor or seasonal employment outside the county. Finally, and most importantly, the soil near the river Drava was rich with clay, and the river banks were loaded with gravel and sand, all essential for production of construction materials such as brick and concrete. Now, little bit about just about the context of Yugoslavia in 1960s, as is important for what I'm looking at. In the first half of the 1960s, Yugoslav leaders sent first signs of economic slump, so they decided to reform the socioeconomic system. On macro level, among other things, the party abandoned the full state control over investment policies and established an independent financial sector, or semi-independent financial sector, which signified the first fundamental step towards formation of the Yugoslav business world. More importantly, the reform finally allowed companies to freely manage most of their income. This gave them a free hand to expand or maintain existing capacities, build the new sections, modernize production or services, diversify companies' business, increase workers' wages, bonuses, and so on. Now I will focus a little bit more on the company itself. Apart from the medium-sized food processing enterprise Vajda, you may have heard of it, and 2 mediocre textile companies, the county was spared of major industrial sites. Maybe you remember MTČ, that also doesn't exist anymore. This started changing when the communists in Čakovec answered the call from the federal government to take part in the systematic industrial consolidation. City leaders initiated formation of građevinski kombinat Međimurje in 1963 by merging 2 smaller construction companies together with 3 old brickyards and united artisan services employing few dozens of electricians, plumbers, tinsmiths, and mechanists. Opening of the project bureau was the last step in completing the entire vertical structure of the company, capable from producing blueprints, they were capable of producing construction material, and finally erecting buildings. The first general director was a partisan veteran and the first post-war president of People's Assembly of Čakovec, which could be the equivalent of mayor. His name was Josip Horvat Zdelar. He had little or no experience in the role of business executive before taking the head office. The lack of experience, however, would not necessarily mean absence of entrepreneurship or capacity to steer an enterprise, since he surrounded himself with qualified management staff. In 1966, Zdelar prematurely died, and in his place, the Workers' Council appointed an engineer, Mirko Jagic, a member of the new generation of professional managers. Unlike his predecessor, Jagic accumulated executive experience by overcoming the company hierarchy step by step. Once in the head office, Jagic, together with his technical director, Daniel Režek, once in the head office, Jagic, together with his technical director, Daniel Režek, started a technocratic experiment, and in a matter of 15 years, guided the company into the realm of Yugoslav big businesses. It is safe to argue GK, or Građevinski kombinat, I call it GK everywhere in the article that I wrote on this, had an unenviable starting point. In the 1960s, the brand new construction combine had no strategic importance in the eyes of the state, since it was just another enterprise in the sea of Yugoslav construction enterprises. In other words, GK had little or no support from Zagreb or Belgrade and had to rely solely on financially weak local administration in Čakovec, but primarily on its capacities and cadre potential. The management, however, had one favorable circumstance. The new law on enterprises from 1965 significantly increased the autonomy of self-management and management over company policymaking, including intervention in the organization and structure, as well as control over capital investments. Jagic and Režek exploited every last avenue of the awarded decision-making freedom in order to expand the company. The new management put their focus on maximization of profit and growth based on the retain and reinvest business methodology. Following the principles of modernization and profit efficiency propagated by the reform, in the first year of their management, they laid off 250 workers, or 20% of them, of the total workforce, probably for their lack of any qualification. In a matter of few months, the Workers' Council accepted management's proposal and shut down the ceramics department together with one of the brickyards on the grounds of being unprofitable operation. While blue collars got disciplined and re-educated for the new market conditions, the next priority on leadership's agenda was acute lack of experts. To resolve this problem, Režek and Jagic restructured the system of income distribution and bonuses in a way to make GK welcoming and comfortable for white collars, but also to make them accountable for the performance of their projects. Economic power of the company and the share of salaries in it were vital for penetrating the domestic market. To spread its business out of the local area, GK had to keep the prices of their services low, especially when bidding to seize capital projects. They were successful in doing so by keeping salaries of unqualified and semi-qualified majority of collective almost below the minimum. For instance, in 1968, half of the workforce in the company had a salary of 45,000 dinars, which was then equivalent of $36, and today it would be roughly around $270 when you calculate the inflation. In other words, the way in which the new management pursued profitability consisted of insisting upon both productivity and efficiency based on the financial stimulation, as well as the competitive and professional interrelations in the collective. One can argue that by changing the economic discourse from overcoming the backwardness with increasing the social reproduction, into maximization of profit for the sake of integration with the market, the post-reform Yugoslavia gradually shaped a new business culture that put question mark above the basic socialist principles and ideas of development. Modernization of work process was another important area affected by the change of leadership. The new management used their expertise and know-how to extend the productive part of the calendar. They transferred their knowledge of how to build and use construction materials in colder parts of the year to site supervisors and other responsible workers. Working during the winter season was crucial for emerging on the Adriatic market. Construction of restaurants complex in Pula in 1966 was their first major project, one that marked the beginning of GK's business expansions. Istrians were satisfied with the results, and the following year they offered two more larger tourist projects in Rovinj and Poreč for 14 million dinars, the largest sum the company cashed in thus far. By the end of 1960s, the company specialized in civil and industrial engineering. Construction of buildings for tourism was mostly done on the coast, while residential industrial objects were primarily reserved for Međimurje and surrounding area. For instance, Čakovec, the home city, got a new hotel, a sizable factory for the textile company, spacious grammar school, modern department store, and several residential buildings on 10 levels. Together, they radically transformed the city landscape, turning it from an artisan trading settlement into a modern city, and it was all built by the GK workers. In turn, those contracts between 1967 and 70 increased the company total revenue from 32 to 200 million dinars, and more than doubled the workforce from 900 to 2,200 employees. In other words, the company and the county developed a form of strong codependency in their mutual prosperity. Režek's role in GK, the technical director, Daniel Režek, his role in GK and local administration served as the most illustrative example of strong symbiosis between the two structures. He arrived to one of the future company components after finishing his degree in 1961 and immediately claimed the office of a young technical director, since at that moment he was a very rare construction engineer in the county. For the same reason, and at the same time, he got employed in the newly established high school in Čakovec, specialized for a variety of trades in construction sector. Without the contract with an engineer, the school was unable to receive a much-needed license to legally teach students and shape future qualified workers of GK. Full control over the local construction market coincided with Režek's career advancement in 1974 when he was elected county president. During his political mandate, GK received major infrastructural, commercial, and public projects such as the modern post and telecommunications center, the large city overpass, as well as the first power plant on the river Drava. Towards the end of his mandate in 1977, Režek invested into modernization and expansion of construction school, and GK enriched Čakovec, which a brand new center for construction trades with a regional gravitational reach, alluring students from all neighboring counties, even from Zagreb. In 1978, Režek got a promotion and claimed the position of state minister for construction. This again had repercussions for the company, since now it had an important voice in Zagreb. At the turn of the decade, GK made a lucrative deal with one of the wealthiest companies in Yugoslavia, the oil and gas giant INA, to build them an IT center. More revealing proof of stronger ties with Zagreb and the party was the awarded contract for building the famous political school in Tito's birth town, Kumrovec. In the same period, the company also breached the state borders and gradually started building in Bosnia and Serbia. Entering the new decade was also marked with the first listing of GK among the top 130 largest production enterprises in Yugoslavia. In the year of great oil crisis, the company had 4 billion dinars and total revenue of 6,000 and over 6,000 employees. However, although GK managed to preserve stability until 1981, total breakdown of Yugoslav economy in its last decade knocked the Čakovec-based giant to its knees, same as the rest of the Yugoslav business scene. Skyrocketing illiquidity and indebtedness entirely suffocated the economy. The government responded by imposing restraints to uncontrollable capital investments in the whole country, which in turn almost completely silenced the construction market. The company faced challenging task to keep the 7,000 workers strong giant on its feet. While the country's leaders and economists insisted upon exporting, GK found itself in the dead end, as it never seriously opened to the foreign markets, probably because there was no need to do so, since the market in Yugoslavia flourished in the previous decade. In the mid-1980s, however, once again, Režek's career trajectory could have had a significant effect on the business performance of the company. Following the end of his minister mandate, Režek claimed the office of the General Director of INGRA, Construction Consortium for Exporting Construction Services to Non-Aligned Countries and Eastern Market. For still unknown reason, however, the management in Čakovec would not be part of this deal until the end of the decade, when it was already far too late. Needless to say, in the start of the 1990s, one successful company was first pulled out of the category of social property, renationalized and privatized as its massive industrial capital was gradually plundered through the model of the downsize and distribute. The case of GK Međimurje provides us with a valuable insight on the role of politics behind the businesses in Yugoslavia, but also shows the line between economic and political elites and how the former at certain point even got subjected to the latter for their own business interests. Moreover, on one hand, GK represents a rare example of the successful reform project as its management efficiently implemented a technocratic model of governance aimed towards stronger integration with the market and maximization of profit, but also permanent growth in Keynesian fashion of retain and reinvest. On the other, all the technocratic novelties implemented by the management at the same time justifiably put a large question mark above the principles of socialist development. In other words, is it legitimate to qualify the profit-oriented society and its companies as socialist? Keeping in mind the evolutionary trajectory and the fate of this microstructure, I would argue no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha. Exactly 15 minutes. Thank you as well for that. Yes, and now Tina is our third speaker. Tina, as I said, a PhD student at the University of Zagreb, working on SUBNOR organization, the organization of partisan veteran fighters from the Second World War, and here within the project covering two municipalities, Labin and Sisak, but today speaking about the international cooperation of the SUBNOR from the region of Rijeka. Tina, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Igor. Just a second to manage the share screen option. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, I'm the youngest here on this project, and I'm still on doctoral studies on my third year right now, and it's really a great honor to be here with you on this this very panel. Okay, yeah, my research team is about the position and the influence of the partisan war veterans and their organization in Croatian politics and society during the 1970s and 1980s. The years that I mentioned proved to be the period when local branches of SUBNOR became more productive, better, well organized, more independent, and in the meantime, their greater engagement in everyday political life was strongly promoted by the Republican Board of Organization. For the needs of the project, the two case studies were selected. Therefore, the Municipal Board of SUBNOR Labin in Istria and Municipal Board of SUBNOR Sisak in Central Croatia are my case studies. Archival sources for this research are mainly the documents of SUBNOR's local and Republican board, and with a combination of a selection of a relevant newspapers, local or regional material. For this presentation, I prepared the selection of material which I found in state archives in Rijeka, and it's related to the international cooperation of SUBNOR. The totality of connections with the foreign veteran organization and their communication, we can understand as international cooperation, of course, but the connection with the Italian Veterans Organization and their communication, we can also observe as a regional transnational cooperation on this territory of Rijeka region. SUBNOR, founded in 1947 as a socio-political organization, gathered former partisan fighters, war invalids, families of the fallen fighters, the ones who actively supported the national liberation movement or were interned or deported in the concentration or working camps, and other groups such as veterans from the Spanish Civil War. SUBNOR's role in decision-making process was really important, and he was recognizable by its commitment to the politics of the League of Communists and its ideological promotion in the public sphere. Besides taking care of the socio-material well-being of its members, SUBNOR's main task was to preserve the partisan memories of the National Liberation War and promote the state's policy and ideology in the public sphere, especially the ideology of the Yugoslav socialist patriotism. By the manifold materialization of the memory of war, such as monuments, events, exhibitions, museum exhibitions, culture, commemorative or popular events, SUBNOR participated in the process of shaping of the collective memory. The task of nurturing of the war and the revolutionary tradition, like it was called in SUBNOR, in the period of late socialism was strongly oriented towards the younger generations. And the process of keeping the memory wasn't possible without interconnectedness with other social subjects and other institutions. As Milan Slani, the president of a regional SUBNOR board of Rijeka, stated in 1974, he said, our memorial areas should not stand just as cold plates or empty reconstructed huts shrouded in oblivion, but must become the places of creative gatherings of youth and citizens. That's why we will transform these memorial places into work sites for making pleasant and appropriate places for mass gatherings to produce a cult of respect and acknowledgement to the ones who won the war for freedom of the nation and nationalities by their sacrifices. But at the same moment, those places should become the centers of sport, recreation, vacation, and the meetings and places for our youth and citizens who will themselves participate in making these centers and in organizing the cultural and popular events in the spirit of the revolutionary traditions and socialist humanism. The international SUBNOR's cooperation was one of its special assignments, which became elaborated and especially productive in the 1970s and 1980s. According to the statute in 1970, SUBNOR will stand for world peace, peaceful cooperation and equality between nations against any war and aggression. At the same time, it will stand for the true understanding of the revolutionary liberation struggle and Yugoslav self-managing socialism. That meant that in its cooperation, SUBNOR should follow the official line of the Yugoslav foreign policy by respecting the non-aligned policy, establishing the stronger relationships, connections with the non-aligned, with the anti-fascist coalition, and with members of resistant movement, veterans of the resistant movements, as well with other socialist countries. There was no place for cooperation with veterans of former Nazi or fascist army, of course, like in the case of two Wehrmacht associations from Western Germany, whose direct request for cooperation SUBNOR rejected. Even though the international cooperation was not completely international, SUBNOR was still strongly involved in this cooperation, which was rich in varieties of nations, political and social systems, ideological and historical backgrounds. Some of the aims of international veterans cooperation were to foster global peace and general disarmament, and also to share the national experiences in medical, financial, and social aid systems. Besides, SUBNOR used international cooperation as a channel for promoting the memory and the history of the national liberation struggle and the Yugoslav self-governing model of socialism, as well as for fighting against any kind of neo-fascism or Yugoslav emigrant propaganda. On the federal level, by the 1980s, SUBNOR cooperated with 80 different national veterans associations and with 3 international veterans organizations, from Soviet, Polish, and East German veterans to French, Norwegian, and some African and Indonesian war veterans. When we look down to the Republican level, the very first and well-organized multi-dimensional veterans cooperation was established within the Municipal Board of Rijeka. Till the 1970s, the cooperation was mainly in form of mutual personal contacts and veterans delegations visits, especially on occasions like war commemorations or Liberation Day celebrations. For example, Croatian and Slovene veterans were regular guests on commemorations for victims of Gonars concentration camp in Italy, where their comrades died during the Second World War. According to the new constitution in 1974, the community of municipalities of Rijeka was introduced as a regional administrative unit. And the regional SUBNOR's board, which was then at that time re-established, was also organizationally and functionally improved. With its 19 SUBNOR municipal boards, local SUBNORs, and around 49,000 members, it was on the head of the SUBNOR's international cooperation. The strongest connection SUBNOR developed with the Italian partisan veterans organization, the acronym is ANPI, Associazione Nazionale Partigiani d'Italia, especially from the north and northeastern parts of Italy, for example, regions Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, Emilia-Romagna, Trentino, Alto Adige, Veneto, etc. That kind of cooperation was the most practical and simpler with, of course, with neighboring countries like Italy, especially if we bear in mind that that Yugoslavia had a strict border crossing regime till the middle of the 60s. But what was more important here is that connections made during the war were essential foundation for every future veterans cooperation. Mutual struggle was a solid ground for future collaboration on political, social, cultural, and educational level, like in the case of Italian veterans who fought in the ranks of the Yugoslav partisan army after the capitulation of Italy in September 1943. For example, the well-known division Garibaldi in the units of the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia that fought in Montenegro. ANPI and SUBNOR also shared their ideological and political affinities, war experiences, and the geographical vicinity that helped to develop this mutual cooperation, of course. The intensity and quality of SUBNOR's and ANPI's cooperation was even more interesting when we have in mind the political and diplomatic tensions over the Trieste crisis. Despite many public critiques that SUBNOR placed on Italian nationalist groups and government over the border issues, partisan veterans cooperation as well as economic relations between the two countries coexisted in the background scene. The Azimuth Agreements, 1975, brought great relief and enabled even greater regional and international cooperation. Members of SUBNOR and AMPI worked together on encouraging the public opinion in Yugoslavia and Italy to respect the OSIMO agreements, held joint lectures about international cooperation, and made agreements on the common struggle against the nationalist and irreductist propaganda. During the trial process for the Nazi camp in Riziera, Rižarna, in 1976, the Italian, Slovenian, and Croatian partisan veterans conducted a public information campaign in which the stories of captured citizens were presented. It was a common practice to organize joint commemorations of historical dates and places, tours of war memorials, publishing of joint books and brochures, joint exhibitions on war teams, student exchanges, various sport and cultural programs with international participants like partisan marches, for example. For example, the Yugoslav exhibition about the fine arts in the national liberation struggle that was shown for 25 days in Milano in the middle of the 70s was by SUBNOR very well attended. The charters of friendship signed between SUBNOR's municipal boards and local branches of AMPI were in many cases a foundation for a later town twinning process. Yugoslav-Italian Veterans Cooperation usually sparked discussions about the position of the national minorities, especially of the Slovene minority in Italy. The presidency of AMPI asked for SUBNOR's support in its pressures to the government for the better legal protection of the Slovene minority in Italy at the end of the 80s, for example. SUBNOR considered that members of the national minorities who were satisfied with their status can act as ambassadors of friendship and good neighborly relations between two different countries. The transnational regional cooperation had also an impact on developing healthy reasons, since former Italian fighters who fought in the Yugoslav army had large discounts for medical and spa treatments in the Rijeka region. Along with that, the memorial tourism also began to develop thanks to the members of AMPI in the 70s and the 80s, which started coming to the Croatian Adriatic coast along with their families. For example, in the middle of the 80s, former fighters and their families from Modena booked 2 hotels in Opatija in the winter season for 6 months to combine their vacation with a tour of historical places on the National Liberation War in Croatia. The memorial heritage of the national liberation struggle by the end of the 1970s became part of the tourist offer in Croatia and entered into the tourist brochures. Thus, its political and ideological messages coincided with the commercial purposes. With all its political and ideological limits, the international veterans cooperation of this area can conclude that gave its contribution to the development of the transnational regional diplomatic relations and cooperation. And I think that's it for me for now. Yeah. Thank you very much for the attention. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Tina. The questions for you, yes, will follow later after my presentation. And I'm sharing the screen now. Okay. Fine. Here we are. I hope you can see everything and hear me. Okay. So local community as an extended family. What did that mean in the 1970s and 1980s? In this research, I'm covering the whole territory of Yugoslavia, so not a specific local municipalities, but due to the nature of the sources and due to the idea I originally had, I'm really covering the concept and then the practices on the ground in different parts of Yugoslavia. The best practices, the worst practices, those which are mentioned in the sources written on the Republican and federal level. So archival sources are really important, especially those coming from the Socialist Alliance of Working People, from the archives in Zagreb and the archive in Belgrade, then the press, especially the specialized monthly covering Yugoslavia as a whole called Mjesna, zajednica, then legislation, statistics, and of course, all what was written about local administration in the field of political science, administrative science, and sociology, mainly during the 1970s and 80s, and bits later on. Also, although these topics became historical, so after 1990s, there was no interest in them in these fields of science. What's the logic behind a local community, or Mjesna zajednica? Something similar to what we have in Croatia today, and it's called Mjesni odbor, but then again different. And Mjesna zajednica, at least as a term, is still kept in some post-Yugoslav countries. So what's the logic? There is a worker who is active in his or her work time. There, at the company, at the institution where he or she works, at the factory, they might be included in the workers' councils. And that's the way they participate in self-management since 1950 on. But what happens when they come back home? When they are at their home address, at their place of dwelling? Back there, they are just ordinary citizens or consumers of goods, consumers of services. They're enjoying their free time, living in their free time. And what can socialism do with them in those 2/3 of time when they're actually living at their home address? So there is the local community. The local community is a place where they can meet, where they can cooperate, work together, plan together, contribute to their neighborhood. Even more so with the abolition of small municipalities during the 50s, and definitely with the reform of 1962, when large municipalities were formed, for example, around 110 in Croatia, more than 500 in Yugoslavia as a whole. And at that moment, it was clear that there is a level missing. So a level below municipality, which could operate on the very micro level, on the level of a village, larger village, a group of smaller villages, or on the level of a city quarter. Then, with the Constitution of 1963, local communities were introduced, not as obligatory units. That will happen 10 years later in 1974 with the new Constitution. Another thing is really important. So the money is coming from the companies, from the factories. That's the source of financing. The idea was, well, if that money through taxes and other ways is finally reaching the local communities, the workers then should be active in those local communities and decide actually what will happen with that money, in which way that money is going to be used, what sort of services they need there at their home address, how social, that thing was called social standard, meaning health services, education, and everything else, infrastructure, and so on. What do they need? If the money is coming from their workplace, then they should decide as well how to invest that money. So a local community with its bodies was a place for planning and decision making through self-management. So somebody, a person, a socialist man, a socialist citizen was expected to be a self-manager also in his or her free time or leisure. In this way, such a person would become, an element in this triangle, which I showed already in the introduction of this panel. So in the triangle formed by a local community, the basic organization of associated labor, and the self-managing community of interest sees for different sectors, different areas. Local community is the place for discussing what will be done. How much is it going to cost? Who can finance it? And in which extent the locals want that project to happen. It means that the bodies of the local community had to negotiate with the basic organization of associated labor and with SIS, for example, in the fields of trade, education, culture, health, physical culture, so sports, and so on, and so on. For example, if they negotiate with the local bowl in trade, meaning with a local supermarket, they can negotiate about the opening hours of the supermarket, about the products they need, about the behavior of employees of the supermarket, and so on and so on. If they negotiate with SIS of education, then they will state, yes, we need a new school, we need an additional kindergarten, and so on and so on. That was the idea, that these locals should be included in socialist planning. All this meant that citizens had to be mobilized. They had to be included in one way or another. So it didn't happen by using force, of course, but somehow through different activities, through propaganda, they should be motivated to take part in all this decision making. Self-management in the local community was also called direct socialist democracy, and quite often in the 70s and 80s, the scientists were pointing out this side of socialist self-management. Yes, it is a form of direct democracy, and our citizens should participate in it. It meant that behind all this process, there was the larger process going on, or it was planned to happen. That's the Marxist withering away of the state. So the society was supposed to take role of the state, and these citizens had to make decisions which were formally made by the Federation, Republic, or municipality. In such a local community, they know each other better, of course. They can function as an extended family, take care of each other, show solidarity, show empathy, build another sort of society, humane socialism, humanized socialism, which quite often, especially in the late 40s and through a part of the 50s, was quite often accused for being really bureaucratized or for forming alienated citizens, especially in new urban areas, in new neighborhoods. In order to do all this, the citizens were invited to participate in different bodies of local communities. So there was the local community council, the president, deputy secretary, assembly of citizens, Zbor građana as the larger gathering, and then of course referendum, which could be called and organized for a number of reasons. For example, to introduce so-called self-contribution taxes in order to stimulate investments in field of health services, education, or any road construction, or any other field. Apart from these councils, there are also branches of political and social organization. For example, Tina's SUBNOR also was expected to have a branch in every local community. A number of other organizations, Red Cross, for example, Our Children Association, Socialist Youth Alliance, the Party, League of Communists, of course, and so on and so on. All of them were expected, not obliged, and quite often they did not have one if there was a lack of local enthusiasts, activists who would take care of it, but they were, expected to organize such local branches. Apart from that, local communities were sending the delegations and delegates to negotiate with the organizations of associated labor and to be their representatives at the SIS or at a special council within a municipal assembly. That council was called Council of Local Communities and was one of 3 councils in every municipal assembly. As you can imagine, if a local community was expected to do all this, the number of local communities was supposed to rise. And this was going on through the 70s and 80s. The peak was reached in the early 80s with nearly 14,000 local communities around Yugoslavia, nearly 4,000 in Croatia. Here, since we are virtually based in Rijeka at the moment, you can see the number increased from 15 in 62 to 56 in 79. On average, such a local community in Yugoslavia had around 19 square kilometers, or 1,700 inhabitants. Smaller than average were local communities in Macedonia, Slovenia, and Croatia. The smaller it is, it was expected it might be more successful in implementing self-management. It's easier to know each other among 1,000 than among 10,000 people. It's easier to know each other within a village or 3 neighboring villages than in a large city neighborhood with 10,000 people, of course. So therefore, the process of forming newer and newer, more and more local communities was active through the 70s and 80s. 2 examples, one from Dalmatian hinterland, municipality of Imotski. There was a local community, Mjesna, zajednica, Lovreć. Within it, a village called Nikolići, only 320 inhabitants. In 86, they wanted to proclaim their independence from the local community of Lovreć because they were totally unsatisfied with the policy which was coming from the seat of their local community. In terms of investments, in terms of infrastructure, the final line was the introduction of new phone lines. Apparently, the phone lines which were planned for Nikolići were somehow redirected to the seat of the local municipality, to the main village, to Lovreć. And that was actually the final drop. After that, the villagers were writing to the municipality of Imotski, to the Socialist Alliance of Working People, to the Croatian parliament, to the very high level in Zagreb of the Socialist Alliance of Working People, and so on, trying to get a local municipality of their own. According to the law, to the legislation, they were allowed to do so. But as you might imagine, sometimes the local interests were different. And in this case, Nikolići were not allowed as self-managers to proclaim their own local community. On the other hand, a quite large local community, one of the largest in the municipality of Rijeka in the 80s was Gornja Vežica. And they did not mind about it, not at all. There were more than 12,000 inhabitants. They were happy with it. They felt that with such a large number of people, they have more influence on the municipal authorities. They built a new community center where they had different gatherings, manifestations, celebrations, activities, and so on. They formed a special club, which was there for earning money, again, for gatherings, for celebrations, and so on. A carnival, as you might expect in Rijeka, and so on, and so on. As much as 1,000 enthusiasts or activists, activisti, as they were called, were active in that local community, taking care of all these activities of delegations and things which were going on the local and on the municipal level. One of the main issues was the financing, of course. They thought that the municipality of Rijeka was supposed to be decentralized and that more money should be kept on the very local level, in the neighborhood, in the local community. But that was a general process in Yugoslavia at the time. Republics wanting more autonomy from federation, municipalities from republic, and local communities from the municipality. A number of referendums were organized in Rijeka from the mid-60s to the late 1980s. Until mid-80s, 7 of them. The first 4 were quite successful, and the plans were achieved, fulfilled, thanks to more than 1% of income, which was voted on a referendum, and every employed person, every worker was actually then giving 1.2 to 1.5 of his or her income in a special budget, which was then used to construct new roads, new bus stops, new kindergartens, new schools, new health facilities, and so on. Troubles, of course, appeared around 1980 with the economic crisis. The plans were unrealistic, and as they themselves were saying in the 80s, desires were greater than possibilities. For example, the 6th referendum was the referendum was successful, but the plan wasn't, because only 4 out of 12 kindergartens, for example, in the municipality of Rijeka were constructed. Such problems were not a specificity of Rijeka. Of course, they were happening all around Yugoslavia. The ideal activist, so for example, 1,000 of them in Gornja Vežica was supposed to have these characteristics. I have a database of around 100 names from all around Yugoslavia, which were mainly presented in the press and other sources. So they were quite often retired persons, retired army officers, important persons in their villages, people who were ready to contribute, who had certain social intelligence skills, who had enough spare time, who were able to motivate their neighborhood, and of course who had right ideological background. They were the mobilizers of such an extended family in their neighborhoods. One of the names which appears from Rijeka is, for example, Šime Barićev. At first, he was active in local communities, but then in the late 70s and 80s, he's active on higher levels in the municipality of Rijeka. In an interview, he stated that he was always ready to help, that he always enjoyed his job, and that with every new skyscraper built in Rijeka, he felt a new labor victory was achieved. And he had a feeling that he was always a part of it, and that a part of him was built in every new success and every new skyscraper in Rijeka. And there were hundreds of such people, thousands actually, all around Yugoslavia, really enjoying what they were doing and trying to motivate the others, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I'm coming to the very last slides. Edvard Kardelj, Slovenian Yugoslav politician, was considered to be the father of the local communities. In the late 70s, he wrote that actually an individual as a self-manager is the only creator of his or her happiness, not the state, not the system, not a political party. And of course, that was supposed to happen among other places within a local community as well. However, as a father of local community, he somehow, yes, expected, and he was totally right, that citizens would not be ready to hold meetings and political discussions in every building and every block. Fortunately for the system, some were. In the 1970s, a survey showed that nearly 40% of citizens frequently participated at local community assemblies. Others didn't. 61% did not. Why? Usually they said we had no time, or they actually felt there was no use to do it because they felt the decisions were made at some other place, not at the meetings of the local community assemblies. Surveys from the 70s and some other sources also show that municipalities of North, Central, and West Croatia, so the belt from Istria through Kvarner, Gorski Kotar, Zagreb, all the way up to Varaždin and Čakovec, these municipalities were more active in self-management on the local level, more enthusiastic, while Slovenia and Dalmatia, roughly speaking, were lagging behind. So, using the language of the period, local communities were perceived as schools of self-management and as anticipation of a future society. So such an ideal extended family, people helping each other, taking care of each other, showing empathy for each other, were somehow supposed to be a model for the future communist society, eventually one day when socialism would reach that point of development. Of course, the important decisions on social standard and investments were supposed to be made, and quite often they were made on the very local level. There were different levels of readiness to use the tools of self-management at the local level, but also different readiness from the level of municipality, particularly, to allow the local communities to use of those tools that were designed according to the legislation. It was certainly shown that a smaller community meant more self-management, meant more action, more activities, but also more responsibility. This was good, and people were invited to form smaller local communities. But sometimes these processes were stopped, blocked. Why? Because they're especially blocked in cases when the evaluation said, yes, but the willingness, your wish to form a new, smaller local community is actually a consequence of a quarrel, of a fight. And an extended family should not fight. So please try to solve this within the existing local community. Splitting it will not save the problem. That was the message usually coming from the municipal level to those neighborhoods. There were differences, of course, if we speak about rural, suburban, or urban level. I'm not going to go into details now, but for example, Nikolići or Gornja Vežica have shown some of these differences. And of course, the main question or the master question behind all this might be that through researching local communities, we might see how actually decentralized the system of Yugoslav socialism was, and where the main decisions made on the local level, at the local assemblies, or somewhere on a higher level. Okay, this was my part. Thank you, and Vjeran, I believe you are taking over now. You will moderate the questions and answers part. So yeah, please.
Well, first of all, thank you all for these presentations, and I want to congratulate you on very interesting project, very interesting results. Of course, Igor as the primary investigator, but all of the participants. And as I said, I've been following some of the initial work, but I think everything you've presented today was also excellent. And I think it is an example of how the research funding from something like the Croatian Scientific Foundation can be used to systematically analyze this period. So again, congratulations. And I'll take the role a little bit as a discussant, as in a conference, to give you some comments, even though I didn't really tell you I was going to, but and then maybe there will be some questions. But again, I think it's also very interesting, your interdisciplinary approach. Okay, you didn't have engineers or biomedicine, but I mean, as historians, from the different perspectives and how important it is to look at cultural history. Anita, you've already spoken to my other classes about some aspects of that, or this political history or economic history, which I think is often overlooked. So Sasha, that was very, very great. And then your approach in this micro-socialism, micro-history to really understand the society, because the last 30 years, when you talk about socialism, it's always been so generalized and focusing, I don't know, about communist crimes and certain aspects, which of course do need to be discussed, but now you're really deconstructing the inner workings of the society. So again, congratulations, and even conceptualizing the project as it is. And I think it'll be an inspiration to future researchers, because you are somewhat limited by the number of researchers you have, and many other municipalities, comparisons that could be done. And again, also thank you for bringing in Rijeka into the story. Had we been in the conference, I think this would have been an excellent opportunity to exchange more ideas and discuss a lot of the great questions and research you've brought up. And so, but two things which I'll will ask all of you, and I know you're historians, but this class is in cultural studies, and I'm sort of acting as a cultural studies person here, but it's almost an inevitable question is, so how do we compare all these aspects to today, whether it's the construction company, whether it's the relationship with war veterans, with the inclusion of average citizens in culture, or with this activists, the engagement with the local communities. And actually the conclusion from all four of these presentations, was this a totalitarian state? why are we still using this totalitarianism, the two totalitarianisms, when at least from the presentation that we've heard, this micro-socialism, I mean, it seemed very much democratic, open to the West. I mean, even the most rigid, dogmatic aspect of the SUBNOR are engaged in spreading international peace and dealing with these even with the Italians and so-called, other enemies. Okay, the Wehrmacht veterans were excluded, but so you're really presenting quite a different narrative than what has been dominant for the last 30 years when we talk about socialist Yugoslavia or socialist Croatia. So, just the individual questions, and Anita, again, thank you for this very systematic analysis of it and this difference, the masses, culture of the masses versus mass culture. And I think we discussed a little bit in the other course that I was teaching. You were also focusing, I think, on some exchange from the West that was coming in there. But how would you, describe current culture and like the participation of average citizens? I'll go and ask everybody, and then we can have, you could go through the group. And I'm asking this because, in preparation for Rijeka 2020 and all these events that we were presenting and thinking about and trying to get citizens involved, you can come up with an amazing program, especially these like intellectuals and cultural entrepreneurs, but is someone going to consume it? How do you build this culture of consuming, well, whether if it's elite culture or popular culture? So was the socialist model more advanced? I mean, you sort of ended saying that it was a failure in a way, and I'm wondering what you think today's consumers of culture are like, and is there a worker culture or not? And this example of Čakovec, Sasha, was also great, and I think just the most recent events with the earthquake in Petrinja, etc., and the other various corruption cases with sort of construction companies. So I think what you're doing is very important to show, there are other models. They also had their weaknesses, but maybe they had their strengths as well. And I thought your final comment, was this socialism? And I think your conclusion was that it's not. So I think, I don't know if I really have a question, but I thought, maybe comment on, are there similar companies functioning now in Čakovec? I don't know if you're based in Čakovec, that's why you chose that, or so maybe just just compare how these companies function then and today, if you have just a few comments. I mean, again, you can keep your comments quite short. And then Tina, your example of the international activity of SUBNOR, which I thought was great. What about today and the branitelji? Are they engaged in global peace initiatives? Of course, it was Yugoslavia. It was like the non-aligned movement was there, but it seems like what has remained is a lot of these, privileges, or at least the perception of privileges in society, but none of this activist, internationalist aspect. I mean, maybe that's not surprising if it was a homeland war and fighting for a nation state. But on the other hand, it seems like the activity of SUBNOR, again, being so dogmatic, but also engaged in this very global activity, which I thought was great. I mean, my own work on the Spanish Civil War veterans is not that surprising because his community was based on international solidarity. And finally, Igor, again, great work, and you've got a great team, and it's great to see the structure of the local community. I think it's overlooked a lot because we do focus on the top levels of politics. But at the buzzword especially in the US, in the 90s working on East European topics when I was doing my master's and my early PhD. And it was a lot of people who had come from Prague and Poland, and they enrolled in a PhD or master's program. And everyone was talking about civil society, the fact that these socialist societies had no structures. It was all some kind of authoritarian system. And that's why we needed civil society now to like allow these to function. But I mean, what you're describing in a way is like a very functioning local communities. They're activists. People aren't taking, instructions from some apparatchik in Belgrade or Zagreb, but they're engaged in their own community. So again, maybe compare a little bit of, are there these activists in your building? Are you engaged in these things? Is it possible to compare, or not? Is it completely two different systems? So anyway, again, thank you for the comments. I'll definitely be showing this video next semester for my students because we talk about socialism. So if you'd like to respond to my questions or comments, or maybe there's someone of the participants who want to add any question, because I've taken up the time with my comments. Anyone else has a question, or maybe just go ahead, Anita, maybe you can just respond.
I will be very short. Thank you for your comments. Since at the moment I work in civil society, I think I can also give you a non-historical answer that you wanted. And I'm always surprised as how little memory is stayed today from this self-managing culture, actually, in today's strives to actually build this participation of people involved in culture and civil institutions. And I will just shortly remark on the question of failure. I did maybe sound pessimistic in my conclusion, but and I really want to find a good example where this delegation system worked, because I think it is really the most radical imagining of a democratic participation that was ever tried in any system, like a state system. And I really want to find out how complex was it, why these problems occurred. Of course, we cannot imagine, what would have happened if the state didn't fall apart. But I truly believe that there are some positive things, and it was not just human element, as some people like to interpret, that these kind of self-managing experiments failed. So stay in touch, and I'll let you know in 2 years.
Okay. Sasha?
Thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, I mean, comparing it with today, I would say that there is a continuity, but in a bad way, from 1960s onwards, because I would say that business environment in Croatia today has its roots in the reform period from the 1960s onward, in sense of strange combination of deregulation and strong state interference. I would just say that since I worked on this topic in my doctoral thesis, there is a remarkable similarity between businesses in 1960s and 1970s and what some of the companies or large companies in Croatia have done today. The parallel is between Agrokombinat and Agrokor, where both father and son Todorici, the detail to which they did the same thing to the company, it's remarkable. So I would say there is I won't go in details, but the similarity is remarkable, as I would say. You asked about failure. I would say that my case, or the case of Čakovec, GK Međimurje, is one of the really rare cases of reform success. The company that actually listened to what the government had to say and was pushing it to the very extreme, because technocrats were in charge of the development. There was a lot of corruption as well. I've read some of the government documents on this topic, and business corruption in the time of for example 70s and 80s was to the level that it's based to some degree it's incomparable to what we had in the, for example, Sanader era in Croatia, following the documents from UDBA. And Čakovec today, well, I think to some point it got back to its original economic composition that I described in the beginning of my presentation. It became again an artisan zone and a zone of small and medium-sized businesses. They went back to the large industry period, and but at the same time it preserved this really developed well feature, as in a sense of for example they complained that Yugoslavia insisted upon building this merging those big enterprises and not having medium and small size enterprises, and Međimurje actually did that a lot, especially from 2000s onward. So there is also that.
Great. Well, I think it's important to continue this the economic history. So I'm looking forward to the publication of your dissertation once it's defended. I'm sure Ceka Peace will be assisting in the publication and whatever other work you do for this project. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, well, veterans from the homeland war in Croatia are also engaged in the World's Veteran Federation, which is the biggest international veterans organization from the post-war period until right now. I think it consists of almost 200 veterans organizations from all over the world. But still, I think that today is the main occupation is still the privileges, the social politics, the life standard of veterans, the PTSD, of course, medical problems, etc. And in SUBNOR-'s case, the international cooperation, which was oriented towards the spreading the peace, politics, and the stuffs that I mentioned in my presentation were also strongly interconnected with the Yugoslav foreign policy, of course. And I read some documents and the experiences of these Yugoslav veterans are really remarkable, because when they expect on the railway station, for example, some foreign veterans from all over the world, they don't know the language, they don't know how to communicate, but still they receive them, they introduce them to the place, to the historical monuments, and that was a way, a channel to promote the Yugoslav socialism, to promote the national liberation struggle and its history, like to show the world that partisan veterans and partisan fighters at that time were on the winner's side, and that it's really some important today in a post-war world, in a post-war world. That's yeah.
Great, thank you for those comments. So yeah, I guess I didn't realize that the current veterans were part of that organization, but I guess it's not that surprising. So definitely more work to be done on both contemporary veterans and the SUBNOR ones.
Yeah, my turn, right? I mean, yeah, thank you, Vjeran, for all the general comments and encouragement for the project. And when it comes to my topic, well, civil society, yes. I mean, I believe that someday soon there should be a study, a research which would look at the Socialist Alliance of Working People as a sort of organization running something what we might call the civil society within socialism. I mean, that umbrella association was gathering organizations, associations from sport and music associations to for example, pioneer and socialist youth association and so on. So really a wide range of organizations was included, organizations which a lot of them, of course, still exist today. They work in a different environment, in a different legal and social setting. But yes, they existed back then, and it would be worthwhile to comparing actually their existence, their history before 1990 and after 1990, and see what was going on. When it comes to the comparison of the local communities with present-day local boards, from as far as I know, the turnout for the elections for local boards in Croatia is extremely low. It might be one-digit number or maybe slightly more, of course, on average. In socialism, quite often they were not happy with 30 or 40% of people participating at assemblies. So assembly is a meeting, not election. If you are interested, if every third citizen is interested to come to a meeting to discuss what's going on in the neighborhood, I think that's really a high turnout, and it can secure that a certain that direct democracy can function up to a certain point. Of course, there are maybe other ways in which citizens can be active today or after 1990, but of course, I'm doing research of the pre-1990 period, and after 1990, I have my own impressions. I don't have research results, research data of my own, but my impression is really that the participation of citizens was much higher back then. Another question, of course, is who was participating and why? What was the structure of those people? What were their political opinions, attitudes, memberships in different organizations or in the party, of course? That's a special analysis which might show interesting results.
Okay, thank you for all of those comments. Is there any other questions from the participants? I was told there were no questions on the YouTube channel, which some people were following. So we're out of time, and I have a PhD defense to go to, but I would like to also invite the panelists and the other people listening to another webinar we're having on Friday at 10:30, also part of the Memoryscapes. It's the final one. It was another panel that was supposed to be at our conference, and it's the Rijeka in Flux presentation, what we have so far. So a number of the members of the Rijeka in Flux team will be discussing the digital mapping techniques that we've done, and the tours and the historical analysis of Rijeka in the 20th century that is part of that project. So that will also be posted with the links on the Cultural Studies website tomorrow. But that's at 10:30 on Friday. So again, thank you again for presenting the project. I look forward to in a year or two hearing about some more results, and for some more cooperation and collaboration. And maybe I'll see you at the Socijalizam na Klupi, which will be in September?
Late September, early October, yeah.
Okay, great. Hvala I vidimo se. Ciao.
Hvala tebi.